I'm Lindsay Sturkey, and welcome to Simple Spiritual Practices. This episode is part of the Summer Replay series featuring some of my favorite episodes and foundational practices. In each episode of this podcast, we'll talk about one tangible practice that will help you know yourself and God better. Most of these practices can be done in 5 minutes or less, so you can easily try it out today. If you are ready to experience real growth in your life, or if you want fresh ideas on how to approach your time with God, this podcast is for you. Something that you may or may not know about me is that I am not really a very talkative or loud person in general. Now, maybe you wouldn't think this because obviously I talk and say a lot of words on this podcast. And if I'm in a one-on-one conversation, I might actually say quite a bit, but usually in social settings, I'm probably one of the quieter ones there. I prefer to kind of just fade into the background, and if I'm in a group conversation, I generally do more listening than talking. But even if I'm being quiet, my mind is usually pretty full and loud. Even if I'm not talking, that doesn't mean I have nothing to say. It's just that my words are usually internal. I kind of tend to be in my own little world a lot of the time. So even as I sit down to create this episode today, I have a lot on my mind. For example, I just dropped my girls off for school this morning. They started kindergarten this year, and they're going in person, which I'm really grateful for, but it's been a big adjustment for all of us because, of course, they've not been in school since March, and that was just 3 mornings a week. Now they're going every day, all day, and along with all of the normal new things about kindergarten, which is quite a lot, there's also masks and keeping your distance from other kids. There's toys that have to be kept on a shelf so germs aren't shared. All kinds of new things to navigate. Also, one of my girls had a bit of separation anxiety at first, so she cried several days at drop-off. So this new transition for them is something that is constantly taking up space in my mind. And I know that they'll adjust and it takes time, but this is still just, I'm carrying some anxiety about it. So it's always taking up some room in my head. Also, their birthday is next week, so that's on my mind. I have a list of things that I need to do to get done, to get presents and for their party, and just trying to figure out how to make it a really special day for them. So this is in addition to just that constant list of things that are left undone in my house and in my life in general that's always running through my head. It's like I have this nagging sense in me that there's all these things that I'm not doing that I should be doing, and it creates this low-grade tension, and it's just begging to be resolved by just getting all of it done. Not to mention the state of the world right now, the pandemic and COVID numbers and the upcoming election. All of this is constantly taking up space in my mind, and sometimes it just runs on a loop in my brain. It's like these points of stress just keep running over and over again in a way that's really not helpful. And it can make me feel like my mind is kind of spinning. Now, I share this with you not so that your mind can be spinning too, but because you have your own list of things that takes up space in your mind as well. Even now, as I'm sharing what's on my mind, you're probably thinking of several things that are taking up space in your head too. So the way I would describe this inner chaos of competing thoughts is mental clutter. Now, I kind of think this has a similar effect as physical clutter that's in your house. At least it does for me. So when there are like dishes covering the counter, when there are toys all over the floor of every room and just stuff everywhere, it really does impact my overall mood. It makes me feel stressed and unsettled. And I know it's not like that for everyone, but for me, and probably for a lot of you as well, my outer environment greatly impacts my inner mood. When everything is put away and there is space in my home, it's like my insides start to settle a bit and I feel like I can breathe just a little bit easier. So this is true internally as well. Just as external chaos and noise can make us feel unsettled, that constant clutter of thoughts and to-do lists and stresses in our minds can make it really hard to be still and to feel at peace. So last week we talked about the practice of silence and how because our lives can be pretty full of noise, Being silent in God's presence can be really impactful. But the thing is, even when we take away the outer noise, when we turn off the TV or the music, or we get alone in a quiet room with no one talking and no sound externally, there's still that mental noise that makes it really hard to be still and to listen and to rest in God's presence. So if you tried that practice of silence that we talked about in last week's episode, you may have found that as soon as you sat down, you set your timer and closed your eyes to begin, it's like all of a sudden you were bombarded with the most random thoughts. So it might be little annoying details like maybe your grocery list, or you thought about that form you haven't turned in for your kids' school yet. Or you could have had big things on your mind like something you're worried about with one of your kids, or maybe there's a conversation you had with someone that just kind of keeps replaying in your mind. You may have found that it was just really difficult to allow your mind to settle. So you may have had silence on the outside, but even with that, our minds can still be a pretty loud place. So what do we do with that? How do we sit in silence when our minds refuse to be quiet? So I want to share with you a simple practice that you can do to help with this, and it's called download. And the main purpose of this practice is to clear the mental clutter by getting it out of your head so that you can create space for God. So let's talk about what this practice is, and then I'm going to walk you through how to do it. So the practice this week is called download. And the purpose of this practice is to get whatever is cluttering up your mind out of your head in order to be still on the inside and not just quiet on the outside. And the way that we're going to do that is through writing it down. Now, some of you are probably thinking, but I hate journaling. I don't like doing that. I've tried it, can't keep up with it, don't want to do it. So let me assure you, this is not journaling. That is not what this is. Personally, I really enjoy journaling and I find it really helpful, but journaling is something that I do in a nice notebook with neat handwriting, and I kind of try to make it, flow and make sense and that sort of thing. But for this practice, just grab any scrap piece of paper that you have handy because you're not going to keep it. This is not supposed to be pretty or even make all that much sense if you were to read it later. So it kind of should take the pressure off knowing that this is going in the trash because you can write messy, you don't have to make it sound good, you don't have to worry that your great-great-grandchildren might read it one day. And it's okay to jump from one topic to another because that's kind of how our brains work. We've got a lot going on up there. You don't even have to write sentences. It might work better for you to just make a list or write down some bullet points instead or write random words. So this practice gives the noise in our brains a place to go. And once we've written down what's on our minds, it can make it a lot easier to still our hearts. Okay, so I call this practice download. I've also heard it called brain dump. There's another term. There's a book called The Artist's Way, and it's a book by Julia Cameron, and she talks about a process called morning pages, where you write 3 pages by hand first thing in the morning, just kind of stream of consciousness writing. So in that book, she writes this: the pages are meant to be simply the act of moving the hand across the page and writing down whatever comes to mind. Nothing is too petty, too silly, too stupid, or too weird to be included. She goes on to say, all that angry, whiny, petty stuff that you write down in the morning stands between you and your creativity. So in a similar way that Julia Cameron talks about, I think that all those things that you could write down in this practice might also be standing in the way between you and being able to rest in the presence of God. Now, I do want to point out here, it's not that you have to get rid of those inner thoughts in order to get to God. That's not what I'm saying, but rather think of doing this process with God. As you're writing, as you kind of get all of this out of your head and onto paper, know that God is in it with you. He is there in your messy tangle of thoughts. He is right there in the chaos. So recognize that He's with you as you do this, and then we're going to surrender all of that mess to Him. So now let's walk through step by step the best way to do this practice. Step 1 is to grab a piece of paper that you don't mind throwing away when you're done and a pen. So I would suggest actually writing this with a physical pen and paper as opposed to typing it out on your phone or the computer, because I think that physical act of writing does something to slow your mind down. So I know that for me, I can type a lot faster than I write. So sometimes if I do this and I type, it ends up making my mind go faster. It almost speeds my mind up, which is the opposite of what we're trying to do, right? But when I write by hand, I can only get the words out as fast as my hands can physically write them. So it just helps me to slow and settle a little bit more when I do this by hand. So grab a scrap piece of paper and a pen. Step number 2 is set your phone timer for 5 minutes. Now, as we talked about last week, you don't want to be distracted by this during doing this practice by glancing at the clock to see if your time is done. But I also think it can be helpful to give yourself a limit to say, I'm going to get out as much as I can within this set period of time, because otherwise you might actually stir up more anxious thoughts to write down rather than getting them out. So we're just going to do this for 5 minutes and then we're going to stop. So step 3 is write down your thoughts to get out the mental clutter. So this is the actual step of writing it out. Now this can be messy, it can be random. It's just whatever is taking up space in your mind. So there's a few different ways that you can approach this step. So the first, you could just write pure stream of consciousness. Write anything that pops into your head and just let it be completely random. Or second, it could be more of a to-do list. If the thing that's distracting you and taking up space in your head is just all the things that need to get done, just write down a list of all those things that you can think of, because sometimes just getting them out of your head and onto paper can make it feel just not quite as overwhelming. So third, maybe you want to focus on a particular problem or issue that is cluttering up your mind. So you might just choose to focus on one thing and list out everything you're feeling or thinking about when it comes to that one area. So maybe you're feeling anxious about a meeting that's coming up, or maybe it's a behavior issue with one of your kids. Just write down all the thoughts and questions and whatever comes into your head about that one particular issue. So if you're not sure where to start, don't overthink this. Just pick up the pen and start writing and see what comes out. So that was step 3, and then a few ideas of how to approach it. So the fourth step is when that 5-minute timer goes off, set the paper aside and turn it over so you can't see it. You don't want to keep staring at the paper or reading over it or dwelling on what you wrote down. The point is to get it out and release it and then move on. Which brings us to step 5. Say a short prayer of surrender for all that was in your head. This could be as simple as, God, I give all of these messy thoughts to you. So a huge part of this practice is inviting God into the chaos of our minds. Or really, it's recognizing that God is already in it with us. We're just choosing to see that and to name it. God is not just with us in the silence. He is also right there in the chaos and stress of our minds and of our everyday lives. So we want to not only release those thoughts and move on from them, but we also want to actually surrender them and give them over to God as well. Number 6 is allow yourself to rest in the outer and inner silence for a few moments. Notice how it feels to get all those thoughts out of your head and onto paper. See if it helps you to get to a more still and peaceful place. So I do want to say here that if it's been a while since you've given your thoughts some space to come out, you may find that 5 minutes is not nearly enough, that your mind is still spinning even after this practice. So with that, it might have actually stirred up more than it helped to settle. But here's the thing, if you will do this practice over time, if you will give yourself space on a regular basis to get all of that out of your head, hopefully this will become more and more helpful. But if you have this huge backlog of anxious thoughts that have had nowhere to go for a while, it might take a few times with this practice before it actually helps you create some space. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're doing this practice. Okay, so here's a bonus step. If you want to take this a step further, Try first doing this practice of download that we talked about today, and then follow that with the practice of 5 minutes of silence. See if that silence feels different to you. Maybe it helps you to get things out of your head and onto paper before you sit in silence, and it helps you slow your mind down so that it's not racing, so you're not distracted as much. So try doing this practice of download on a regular basis, almost like a release valve for your mental clutter. Or you also might just kind of pick it up and use it on those days that you're feeling overwhelmed, or maybe your mind is particularly anxious that day, or your thoughts are kind of racing. When you find yourself in that place, just take 5 minutes to get it out of your head and onto paper and see if that might help you get to a stiller place inside. So if your mind is a noisy place, kind of like mine is, I hope that you find this practice helpful. It always amazes me how spending just a few minutes to get all of those messy thoughts out of my head and onto paper can help me feel just a bit of relief, especially as I invite God into that process with me. I hope that this helps you to slow down your mind, get out the mental clutter, and create some space for God. Thanks for joining me today for this episode of Simple Spiritual Practices. If you want to download a free toolkit of 5-minute practices or find other resources to help you take next steps, visit lindsaysterkey.com/free. This podcast is part of the New Hope Podcast Network, and production is done by Darren Hansen. You can check out all the podcasts on the network by visiting newhopechurch.cc/listen. Make sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode in our summer replay series, and we'll be back with new episodes this fall.